I've been overshadowed by my golden child sister my entire life. The favoritism from my parents felt like a dark cloud looming over me, and it came to a head on my wedding day when I finally got my sweet revenge. From childhood, it was clear that my sister was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Every time she accused me of something, my parents would believe her without question and punish me accordingly. I could present undeniable proof of my innocence, yet they would still find a way to scold me. Birthdays felt less like celebrations for me and more like a showcase for her preferences. My cake was always her favorite flavor, and my parents pretended not to notice my disgust. The imbalance was glaring. They bought her more gifts, took her on outings, and let her dictate the plans, even when it was supposed to be my special day. As my sister grew up, she became more spoiled and used me as her personal punching bag. In our early years, she mostly ignored me, but that changed as we entered our teenage years. She lost all her friends, though I could never quite figure out why. Was it that her friends moved away or abandoned her because of her mean nature? I never knew, since we were never close. My parents would boast about her accomplishments, while constantly highlighting my flaws, often using them as teasing material. I only discovered her lack of friends because we attended the same school, where I noticed the shift. Meanwhile, I was somewhat popular, and when she realized this, she flipped the script. I became more than just an occasional target. I was now someone she needed to bring down at every opportunity. She started accusing me and my friends of all sorts of things, and my parents, blinded by their favoritism, stopped letting me hang out with anyone she deemed bad. I would hear their excuses. Why can't you be like your sister and enjoy family time? The only thing that saved me from complete isolation was my extended family. Most of them lived in our hometown, and I got along well with my cousins, despite our age differences. One day at a family gathering, when they invited me to something I couldn't remember, I sadly replied that I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. When asked why, my innocent child self blurted out, "Because I can't have friends since my sister doesn't have any." That revelation made its way back to the adults, leading to a confrontation with my parents. They were furious, but it sparked a crack in their facade, and I ended up grounded for a month. Despite the punishment, I felt a small sense of victory. At least they realized the extent of my sister's behavior. When my sister changed schools, I assumed it was due to the humiliation of our extended family knowing her social status. She demanded a switch, and my parents complied, even though it meant a longer commute for them. She made new friends at the new school, but reverted to tormenting me. I became her emotional punching bag once again. Even her friends would come over to bully me, which my parents dismissively labeled as light teasing. I was too afraid to invite friends over because my sister would accuse them of stealing, and of course my parents would believe her without hesitation. Then came my first boyfriend. I was hesitant to bring him home, but my parents insisted. One day, while we were separated, he came to find me, clearly upset. He told me my sister was flirting with him, wearing skimpy clothes and batting her eyelashes while trash-talking me. He was irked by her antics and quickly came to my defense. But my sister spun a different tale to my parents, claiming my boyfriend had tried to flirt with her and that she had rebuffed him out of loyalty to me. Guess who they believed? Of course, my boyfriend wasn't perfect, but my resentment towards my sister clouded my judgment. I was a teen drowning in unfair treatment, and the bitterness bubbled beneath the surface. Let's talk about looks for a moment. My parents were overweight and expressed their love through food, often showering my sister and me with treats. My sister had inherited their build, while I remained skinny, partly due to the punishments that often included the deprivation of snacks. It's important to note that while weight isn't what truly matters, my sister's rude behavior and spoiled nature overshadowed any good qualities she might have possessed. Even during her attempts to flirt, she lacked the grace that comes from working for anything, having always been able to demand it from our parents. My parents forbade me from dating anyone they deemed unsuitable, and though I tried to continue in secret, it became increasingly difficult. The relationships would end, often due to my sister's interference. With my next boyfriend, she accused him of flirting with her when he rejected her advances, and again, my parents took her side. They insisted I had poor judgment and kept choosing the wrong partners. Eventually, the Romeo and Juliet-like situation took its toll, and that relationship fizzled out too. As high school progressed, my sister brought home one of her boyfriends, paraded him around like a trophy. My parents couldn't stop raving about him, constantly comparing me to her and questioning why I couldn't find someone as good. But eventually, he vanished from the scene, only to be labeled a conniving bastard who had tricked her. Life continued in this vein of unequal treatment. She had more spending money, better curfews, and total freedom to go wherever she pleased. Whenever I pointed out the disparities, my parents dismissed my concerns with excuses like, "She's older." But when I reached that age, the same privileges never materialized for me. Instead, they claimed I couldn't be trusted, citing my sister's accusations as proof of my supposed bad judgment. Time marched on, and my sister prepared to graduate from high school. She received acceptance letters from a college that, frankly, was not well regarded, and she had no scholarships to speak of. All her achievements were magnified while mine were overlooked. So I had no idea how many colleges she had applied to or how badly she had been rejected. What I did know was that her grades were poor. Celebrating a B was a regular occurrence. I usually received good grades but was met with indifference from my parents. "Why celebrate?" they'd say. "You always do well." When graduation came, my parents made a big show of how they would pay for her college education, lavishing her with praise and fanfare. I felt a mix of relief and despair, knowing she would be leaving, but also knowing that she would return home every other weekend, continuing to make my life miserable. Somehow, things would mysteriously disappear from my room, or she would concoct some other way to torment me. As I neared my graduation, my mother sat me down to talk about my future. She informed me that since they were covering my sister's college expenses, there was no money left for mine. It was best for me to start working right after graduation and wait until my sister finished university to see if they could afford anything for me. If I chose to stay at home, I would need to pay for all my expenses, including part of the bills and rent. I pointed out that student loans were an option, but my mother quickly shut that down, claiming they cared too much to let me incur debt. They would decide if college was worth it, as they believed I lacked the judgment to make good choices. I didn't have any illusions about their treatment. I simply said, "Okay." My mother looked surprised, perhaps hoping I would throw a tantrum, but I remained calm. I thanked her for their concern and left it at that. My father tried the same tactic, but I maintained my composure. After a lifetime of their poor parenting, I had learned not to expect anything from them regarding my education. Deep down, I knew they would find a reason to refuse to pay for my college. While I was determined to make something of myself, I spent my high school years studying diligently. I had limited social interactions and chose to focus on my academics, seeing college as my only chance at freedom. Finally, the moment arrived. After putting in hard work, I earned a scholarship not to an Ivy League school or a prestigious program, but to a decent college with a good course and a full scholarship. Knowing my sister would hate this and try to derail my success through my parents, I decided to share the news on social media, expressing gratitude toward my parents, even though it felt disingenuous. This was a strategic move. They couldn't forbid me from attending without explaining their actions to the rest of the family. At first, they were somewhat proud, boasting about my achievement. But then my sister likely manipulated them, leading to a shift in their attitude. They began questioning whether I was sure I wanted to go, mentioning how my sister was struggling in college, despite being smarter and having better judgment than me. It was evident they were trying to undermine my confidence, but I stood my ground. College became my salvation. I found happiness away from the shadows of my sister and parents. I kept in touch with them, visiting on holidays, but their refusal to contribute financially made it easy for me to excuse my absences. I was determined to carve out my own path, finally free from the suffocating expectations and favoritism that had defined my life for so long. I made it a point to keep any man I was dating away from my family, and soon enough my sister dropped out of college. I knew she hadn't graduated, otherwise my parents would have made a big deal out of it. Instead, she moved back home, living rent-free and bill-free. According to my parents, this was a different situation, and she started working at the same company as my mom, all thanks to my mother pulling some strings. They presented it as a point of pride, almost as if I should be envious. Around this time, I met my husband. You know those people who say they'd act a certain way in a tough situation? Well, my husband is the type who actually does. I, on the other hand, am meek and tend to be a doormat. I often lie awake at night, wishing I'd had the courage to stand up for myself or come up with something clever to say. While I cry when I'm angry, my husband is quick to respond and loves drama, not for its own sake, but to resolve it. He's the kind of person who, if he doesn't immediately reply to a slight, you better worry, because he's probably plotting something worse in retaliation. When it came to marriage, we agreed that we didn't care much about a grand ceremony. Our budget was tight, and we preferred to spend our money on a dream trip to Europe for our honeymoon. Since his family was spread out and mine was mostly concentrated in my hometown, we decided to hold the wedding there. We lived nearby, so we could take weekend trips to manage the preparations. After sending out engagement announcements and save the dates, my parents naturally insisted on meeting my fiancé. I wanted to grow a spine and refuse, but the distance had made me reconsider. Maybe my parents weren't as bad as I thought. However, my husband looked like I'd canceled Christmas when I told him I'd at least ensure they were never alone together. He had prepared for this moment, even buying a high-quality recorder to hide in his pocket to capture their interaction. He was eager, imagining all the ways he could insult my sister and then share the recordings with the family. When he came back from the meeting, he was euphoric. "Babe, you won't believe what they said," he exclaimed. I was confused and wanted to hear the recording, but he wisely suggested I let him explain first to avoid misunderstanding. Apparently, instead of flirting, my parents and sister sat him down to make a shocking proposal. They were willing to pay for our wedding on one condition. My sister would walk down the aisle first, in a wedding dress. They insisted it was unfair for a younger sister to marry first, so it was only right that my sister had that experience at my wedding venue, complete with photos and a cake. Hello, the husband here. Honestly, when they suggested that, my brain practically short-circuited. I was stunned. Did they really think I would consider that a great gift? Even the great hero of Troy would rather take a second trip in the wooden horse than endure this. Once I regained my composure, I had a whole arsenal of insults ready to unleash, but something deep within urged me to string them along instead. I told them I needed to think about it, but I fled before I could give away my plans. My husband recounted how my parents wanted to make my wedding all about my sister. I was shocked the distance had softened my memories of their treatment of me, and I thought they wouldn't stoop that low. Thankfully, my husband's focus on revenge kept me from spiraling into a bad headspace. We brainstormed countless ways to get back at them, from the ridiculously outrageous to more practical ideas. After consulting his level-headed brother, who scolded us for some of our more extreme plans, we settled on a more benign idea. Act like we agreed to the proposal, but hire security to keep my sister out of the wedding. The rest of the plan was mostly my husband's doing, but he insisted I take the lead in sharing it. He returned to my parents, probing to see if they'd even think I would go along with their scheme. He acted like he was willing to help them, pointing out that I don't like conflict, and perhaps I wouldn't make a scene if I was surprised with the plan. Meanwhile, he assured them that he wouldn't tell me anything about it to keep the peace. My parents were shocked, and my sister was literally skipping with joy. They accepted his compromise. My husband then twisted the knife a bit more by suggesting that I'd never actually been good at making decisions in the past, emphasizing how distrustful and controlling I could be. I was, in essence, painted as the neurotic fiancé, and I found it all hysterical. Meanwhile, my sister tried to flirt with him, and he played his part well, acting conflicted to sell it. He would often feign conversations about me that they didn't know he was having with me. He never mentioned the hired security, which made it all the more satisfying. It was amusing how we, who had initially considered a simple courthouse wedding, ended up planning an extravagant one while barely spending a dime ourselves. We figured it was a form of compensation for the emotional toll my parents had caused. Finally, the wedding day approached. My parents, sister, and husband thought they had everything mapped out, believing they could orchestrate the day to highlight my sister while keeping me in the shadows. They planned to have her arrive at the ceremony once everyone was seated, confident they could make the day all about her. But little did they know, we had a few surprises in store for them. The plan was for my sister to arrive at the exact moment to avoid my seeing her and stopping her. By the time I learned what was happening, it would be too late to intervene. To support the ruse about my dress, we saved some leftover fabric from my alterations. My husband took this to my parents' house, where my sister still lived, and showed it to them as proof that he had ruined my dress. He then told them he had to return to me because I was furious and he needed to calm me down. He assured them he would see them at the wedding. As guests and my parents arrived, we made sure to keep our real security hidden at first. They only saw a woman with a list checking names. It wasn't until my parents were settled in that we revealed the actual security, a guy who looked like a bodyguard. We instructed him not to let my sister in, promising a generous tip if he kept our plan confidential. The moment arrived. My parents received a text that my sister was less than 5 minutes away, prompting my dad to signal the ceremony to start. My bridesmaids had been prepped to follow his lead, and without checking with me, they took their places. My dad stood at the entrance, ready to escort me down the aisle. Meanwhile, a friend not in the wedding party texted me to get ready to maintain our cover. This friend was as eager to stir drama as my husband was, so I felt confident we had everything under control. As the bridal song began, the doors opened, and I stepped inside. My dad's expression was one of shock. He looked behind me, but couldn't see the venue entrance from where we were, so he had no idea what had happened to my sister. Just then, his phone rang. I saw the caller ID, it was her. He left me with a mumbled excuse about something coming up, and gasps filled the room. My friend loudly asked what had happened, and I tearfully replied that my dad said it wasn't supposed to be me there. My husband and I had agreed that if my dad abandoned me, I should say that to make him look as bad as possible. The tears I shed weren't just for show. I was genuinely hurt and trying not to cry. My friend then loudly asked what my dad meant by, "It shouldn't be you," ensuring that everyone heard. She quickly ran off to check on the situation, which was all part of our plan to create chaos with the security and keep my dad from returning to stop the ceremony. Eventually, my mom also left. At that point, my husband's dad rushed over to take my arm. He had been forewarned that he might need to do so. His desperate run to my side made me smile. I walked down the aisle amid whispers as people speculated about what had transpired. When I reached my husband, he comforted me, joking that my sad face was so genuine I deserved an Oscar, and reassured me that he would handle my parents for what they had done. We exchanged vows without any further issues. My parents never came back. Throughout the party, I noticed many people leaving and returning, but no one dared to tell me what was happening. Eventually, my husband got a whisper in his ear and went outside. When he returned, his expression was thunderous, but he whispered to me that he needed to hide before he broke character and smiled. It was all going according to plan. According to my friends and family, along with the security guy, my sister arrived in her wedding dress, but the security refused to let her in as we had arranged. He informed her she must be at the wrong venue because there was already a bride present. We had tipped him well for his compliance. My dad, in a panic, attempted to threaten the security guard with the police, claiming he had never heard of him. The guard agreed to call the police, saying he was doing his job. Realizing it was too late, my dad demanded that the security let my sister in. At that point, my friend approached, starting to shout at my sister and asking what was going on. This diversion gave my mom time to arrive, followed by others. The wedding plan was in shambles. All my parents could do was damage control. Guests began screaming at them, horrified that they would even attempt such a thing. Naturally, my parents tried to deflect blame onto my husband, insisting he had orchestrated everything. When he was called over, he put on his best confused look and denied everything. He quipped that they needed proof, and of course, they couldn't provide any. The texts they had exchanged were only about normal wedding decisions. My sister was screaming and crying, throwing a tantrum on the floor, while my dad looked furious, changing colors like a chameleon as he tried to contain his rage. They claimed they had no proof because my husband had told them not to text about it. My husband laughed and pointed out how convenient that was. He ripped into them for being terrible parents and declared he wouldn't allow their foolish schemes to ruin his wedding. He then returned to me, leaving my parents and sister to face the music. No one believed their claims. While the venue had cameras, they wouldn't show the footage to me since it was strictly for security purposes. However, several guests filmed parts of the drama, and watching my parents and sister face the consequences was nothing short of delightful. After years of being accused and not believed, witnessing their humiliation felt like one of the best wedding gifts I could have asked for. My mother was in tears. My dad was fluctuating between fury and despair, and my sister was still on the floor, wailing. They insisted that my husband had colluded with us, but guests kept questioning why he would agree to something so outrageous and why they had even suggested it in the first place. Eventually, they were told to leave, and they had no choice but to comply. My dad had to drag my sister off the floor, kicking and screaming. No one dared to approach me that night, possibly to spare me from the chaos, or perhaps because, for once, I was the bride, not just a guest. It felt as if everyone was making an extra effort to be kind and supportive, excited about the celebration. The lavish food and drinks surely helped too. My husband maintained a serious expression for a short time before breaking into smiles, and we enjoyed a magical evening together. Afterwards, we went to our hotel to catch some rest before heading off on our honeymoon. My parents even tried to pay for our plane tickets, but we thought that would be risky, they might try to cancel them. So we declined their offer. Since then, the three of them have attempted to contact me, but I've refused their calls. My husband insisted on keeping a paper trail, which was a smart move. Eventually, my sister sent me an unhinged message, blaming me for her humiliation and calling my husband a two-faced snake who had fooled them for months. He found that so amusing, he wanted to print it out and hang it on our wall. She also hoped, but was sure, that I would be cheated on by him. She suggested he was cheating on me with her, which was laughable. My husband took screenshots of the call logs, my sister's messages, and messages from my parents demanding I pick up the phone, then sent them all to our family group chat. He included screenshots where they called him names and threatened him. But he kept up the charade of playing innocent and even threatened to sue them for defamation and harassment. In that group chat, he pleaded with my family to help stop my parents and sister from ruining our honeymoon after they had failed to ruin our wedding. He ended by requesting that they not share our locations to prevent my parents from sending my sister over to claim he had agreed to pretend to sleep with her in our honeymoon suite. My family assured him they would handle it, and since then, we've enjoyed a period of peace. My husband is slightly disappointed that my sister didn't break our agreement, as he would have loved to confront her again while tearing her to shreds. We'll see how long the peace lasts. While I would have preferred a loving family at my wedding, at least for once in my life, they not only failed to ruin something meaningful for me, but also gave me the opportunity to get back at them. Many have asked if I know why my family treats me this way. It's a question I've pondered my whole life without a satisfactory answer. I tried asking when I was younger, but they denied any differences and scolded me for being spoiled. So I stopped trying. I've considered various possibilities, but based on my observations, I suspect it stems from my being unplanned. My parents took a long time to have my sister, making her a miracle child in their eyes. Given our small age difference, they probably didn't expect to have another child so soon or easily, and didn't take adequate precautions after my sister's birth. They may not have realized my mom was pregnant until it was too late, leaving them with an unplanned baby while still managing a newborn. They aren't well off, so the extra expense likely weighed heavily on them, possibly leading to resentment towards me. But regardless, I've accepted that the reason doesn't truly matter. What they did was unjustifiable. As for whether they really thought their plan would work, my husband and I theorize that they never intended to go through with it. We believe my sister threw a tantrum over me getting married first, while she struggled to get dates, leading them to make that outrageous proposition. They didn't want to fund my wedding and thought it would make them look good in my sister's eyes if they suggested it, only to be rejected. Then, when my husband accepted, they couldn't backtrack without risking my sister turning on them.